are so many stories about African Americans in the free states between the American Revolution and the Civil War that we don't know. And I think the stories are recoverable, and many people are in the process of trying to do that. There are, in round numbers, about 225,000 free people of color, free African Americans, outside the South, outside the slave states, by the eve of the Civil War. And their origins, who are these people, is one question that is interesting. And my own sense of that is that, for the most part, these are people who were born free, either in the free states or in the slave states and moved to the free states. A second, somewhat smaller group of these people are people who were given their freedom in the slave states and either sent or brought or themselves migrated to the north. And there's a wonderful example of this in Illinois by the governor of Illinois, Edward Coles, who was a Virginian who owned many slaves and tried to talk Thomas Jefferson into freeing his slaves. And Jefferson said, no, I'm not really, I'm too old, we need to have the younger people do this. And Coles actually takes his slaves to Illinois, gives them land, and gets involved in a huge struggle in the early years of Illinois. But there are many other people in other states like Illinois, in Ohio and Indiana, who have a similar background in slavery but have been brought to a free state. So for the most part, the free people of color, the free African Americans in the free states before the Civil War are not fugitive slaves. That is, they are not runaways from slavery like Frederick Douglass was, or like Harriet Tubman was. But those people are really exceptions. Most of the people who live in the North are people who've grown up as free people or who have retained their freedom and are legally free. Now, what are these people doing? For the most part, they're living in families. For the most part, they are living in rural America, just like most white people, although a disproportionate number of free blacks in the North are in cities or small towns. And every small town, it's very common for small towns to have a few African Americans. So what's striking about these settlements of free black people in the North is not that they're concentrated. For the most part, they are not. They're scattered all over in towns, in the countryside, and in a few cities. Chicago is a really good example. Chicago has a rather small population of African Americans before the Civil War, but they are very active, very politically active, trying to overthrow the black laws of Illinois. They have their own clubs and organizations. There's some wonderful photographs in the Chicago Historical Society of these people. John Jones and others, they're just fantastic. And they become an organizing group for people of color throughout the state and ultimately throughout the North. So although they have no legal political right, they can't vote, nonetheless, they're very politically active. And their activism is made possible because they're economically fairly prosperous. These leaders, people like Jones, they're artisans. They run a carriage business or a tailor shop or a caterer. And they also have a life that looks very much like the lives of white people who are in those kinds of jobs. I mean, they go to school, they support their own schools, they go to church, and so on. So it isn't a society apart in the sense of segregation. It is a society at some distance from many white people, although they also are integrated, at least economically, not so much religiously or socially. So there are many stories to be told. Why would people with this background be at all threatened by the fugitive slave law? And I think that's one of the questions that many people ask. The fugitive slave law would surely only threaten people who had actually run away from slavery. Well, one question to ask about that is how many fugitive slaves were there? So that would be one thing to ask. And the other question would be, if you weren't a fugitive slave, how would the law affect you? To take the first question, how many fugitive slaves were there? The answer that most historians believe is, in round numbers, about 1,000 a year escaped from slavery, and that they made up a fairly substantial part of the population of the North, the black population of the North. I think that number is wildly exaggerated. I think it's probably not true. I think it probably, for the most part, the number of fugitive slaves who escaped from slavery actually escaped is probably exceeded by the number of black people who were kidnapped and taken into slavery. So on balance, my hunch is that the number of fugitive slaves is extremely small. But that's some work I'm doing now, and I haven't published this. But anyway, that's my view. First of all, that there are very few fugitive slaves. So then why is there such an uproar about the fugitive slave law? The uproar about the fugitive slave law, I think, has two sources, one on the white side and one on the black side of Northern society. On the white side, there's an uproar because the fugitive slave law requires white citizens to participate in the capture of fugitive slaves, in the sense that Marshall can deputize ordinary white citizens to take part in what amounts to a recapture of a potential fugitive slave, and to do so under circumstances that don't respect the constitutional processes of due process of law. So that they're brought before a magistrate, and the magistrate is paid more if he finds in favor of the owner of the slave rather than the potential or putative slave. So that's the whites. Many whites have a kind of civil liberties opposition to the fugitive slave law. It's interesting that Abraham Lincoln doesn't really make the fugitive slave law a big part of his revulsion against slavery. He's willing to participate in that, although, I mean, he doesn't like it, but he's willing to participate as necessary under the Constitution. On the black side of the story, I think, many black people who are legally free can't prove their freedom. And in any given court, if you're just appearing before a magistrate, you needn't have much legal training at all, and it's going to be paid more if he finds against you rather than for you. If you can't prove your freedom, then the danger of being taken into slavery and sold into slavery under the fugitive slave law is very great. And the reason why that is a tremendous danger for black people in the North has to do with the way slavery is inherited. For example, if a black woman had been freed in, let's say, 1830 and come to Illinois and had children, and then her children had children, so her grandchildren are living in Illinois, there's no way they would have any document that applied to their grandmother to prove their freedom. They certainly never needed such a document for themselves. And the only way to establish their freedom in the eyes of the owner who might be looking for that grandmother is to prove that she was free. They can't do that, and they can't prove that they were free either. So going to Canada or avoiding somehow being caught up by potential kidnappers from the slave states, they better get out of there. And Lincoln speaks very movingly of this. You know, he says that free blacks, because of the fugitive slave law and other matters, the Dred Scott decision in particular, are as if they've been locked in a prison with 100 locks, each with 100 keys, and they've been scattered around every place. So Lincoln realizes that things have gotten worse for black people in the North.